Imagine a family so powerful their empire stretched across continents, their names synonymous with royalty for centuries. They were the Habsburgs, rulers who shaped Europe and beyond. But beneath the glittering crowns and grand palaces, a darker story unfolded. It was a tale whispered in hushed tones, passed down through generations of chroniclers and common folk alike. A story of a relentless shadow, a series of misfortunes so profound, so consistent. They seemed to defy mere chance. Was it fate, bad luck on an epic scale, or something far more chilling? Not just one, but a collection of 7 distinct patterns of tragedy that seemed to follow the Habsburg bloodline like an unshakable phantom. Let's step back in time and explore these incredible, unsettling stories, seeing if you can spot the patterns of misfortune that haunted the mighty Habsburgs. Number 7. The Curse of the Fading Empire. For centuries, the Habsburg name was synonymous with vast power. They ruled over a sprawling collection of lands that included Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and at one point even Spain and its immense overseas colonies. Their motto, A-E-I-O-U, often translated as Austriae est imperare orbi universo. It is Austria's destiny to rule the whole world, truly reflected their ambition and incredible reach. Yet despite their longevity and immense domains, the Habsburg Empire in its various forms seemed to be locked in a slow, almost inevitable decline. It was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual chipping away of influence, territory, and unity. A persistent erosion that no amount of military might or diplomatic skill seemed able to fully halt. One of the first whispers of this fading power could be heard during the reign of Emperor Charles V in the 16th century. He was arguably the most powerful man in Europe, inheriting a truly colossal empire that spanned from the Americas to the Philippines. From Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, he could legitimately say the sun never set on his domains. Yet, despite this unimaginable power, Charles V's reign was a constant struggle. He spent his life fighting wars on multiple fronts, against the Ottomans threatening his eastern borders, against the Protestant Reformation tearing apart the religious unity of Germany, and against France for dominance in Italy. He was a man constantly on the move, a king without a fixed palace, always rushing to the next crisis. He faced a constant drain on his resources and endless rebellions. He was a devout Catholic, but his attempts to suppress Protestantism were never fully successful, leading to decades of religious conflict that destabilized his empire. He finally grew weary, broken by the constant conflict and the sheer impossibility of governing such a vast and fragmented realm. In an act almost unheard of for a monarch of his stature, he chose to abdicate his many thrones in 1556, dividing his vast inheritance. He gave the Holy Roman Empire and his Austrian lands to his brother Ferdinand and Spain its colonies, and the Netherlands to his son Philip II. This division, while seemingly practical at the time, marked a moment the truly unified, sprawling Habsburg mega-empire began to fracture. It was a recognition that one person could no longer hold such a collection of territories together. A subtle hint that the empire's peak might have already passed. Charles V retreated to a monastery, exhausted, leaving behind a legacy of immense power, but also persistent, unresolved challenges that would continue to plague his successors. His personal weariness seemed to mirror the weariness of an empire constantly fighting for its existence and coherence. Centuries later, the ghost of this decline continued to haunt the Habsburgs in Austria. Empress Maria Theresa, a formidable ruler of the 18th century, inherited her vast domains at a time of crisis. The Salic law, which generally prevented women from inheriting thrones, meant that her right to rule was challenged by many European powers. The moment her father, Charles VI, died in 1740, a series of wars known as the War of the Austrian Succession erupted. Prussia, led by Frederick the Great, immediately seized Silesia, a rich province, and France, Bavaria, and Saxony joined in, eager to carve up the Habsburg lands. Maria Theresa, a young woman with a new baby, had to fight for every inch of her inheritance. She famously rallied the Hungarian nobles. By appealing to their loyalty, and against all odds, she managed to hold on to most of her empire. She proved herself an incredibly capable ruler, implementing sweeping reforms in the military education and administration. Yet Silesia, a vital economic and strategic region, remained lost to Prussia, despite her desperate attempts to reclaim it in the 7 Years' War. This loss was a bitter pill, a constant reminder that even the most determined Habsburg ruler could not always prevent the shrinking of their ancient domains. The empire, though modernized, was no longer undisputed master of Central Europe. Prussia had emerged as a powerful rival, forever challenging Habsburg dominance. It was a permanent crack in the imperial facade, a sign that the old order was shifting, and the Habsburgs, for all their resilience, could not turn back the tide of new rising powers. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, this slow erosion of power became even more pronounced and painful. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it was known then, was a multi-ethnic state struggling to adapt to the rising tide of nationalism. Different ethnic groups, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, Serbs, Italians, within the empire increasingly demanded greater autonomy or even independence. The Habsburg emperors, particularly Franz Joseph I, who reigned for nearly 68 years, found themselves constantly trying to balance these competing demands, often through concessions that only temporarily appeased one group while infuriating another. The Ausgleich of 1867, which created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, was an attempt to placate the Hungarians and preserve the empire. It gave Hungary significant autonomy, but it also meant that the emperor now ruled two distinct entities, often with conflicting interests. This compromise, while perhaps necessary at the time, further highlighted the internal divisions and weakened the central imperial authority. Other nationalist movements within the empire continued to simmer and grow. The empire also suffered humiliating military defeats that further diminished its prestige and territory. In 1859, Austria lost Lombardy, a rich Italian province, to the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, and France. 7 years later, in 1866, the Austro-Prussian War, often called the 7 Weeks' War, ended in a decisive defeat for Austria. This loss meant Austria was excluded from German affairs, and Prussia, not Austria, now led the unification of Germany. The empire was pushed out of its traditional role as leader of the German states, a major blow to its ancient status and influence. The once mighty Holy Roman Empire, a title held by the Habsburgs for centuries, had already been dissolved by Napoleon. In 1806, now the Habsburgs were effectively removed from any significant role in the emerging German Empire. These defeats were not just territorial losses. They were significant blows to the Habsburgs' historical identity and their standing among the great powers of Europe. The vast dominant empire of Charles V had shrunk, and its influence was fading in the face of new unified nation-states. The final, catastrophic act of this fading empire played out in the early 20th century. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne in Sarajevo in 1914, sparked World War I. This was the ultimate test for the old, multi-ethnic empire, and it proved to be a test it could not survive. 4 long years of brutal warfare, immense casualties, and economic strain completely exhausted the Habsburg domains. When the war finally ended in 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed completely, fragmenting into numerous independent nation-states such as Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Emperor Karl I, Franz Joseph's successor and the last Habsburg emperor, was forced to relinquish his power. He never formally abdicated, but he knew the game was up. The proud ancient Habsburg monarchy, which had endured for over 6 centuries, was gone. Its motto of universal rule seemed a cruel irony as its domains dissolved into nothingness. The great family, once rulers of half the world, now had no empire to rule. It was the ultimate painful culmination of centuries of gradual decline, a complete and final testament to the curse of the fading empire. Number 6. The curse of the premature end. A crown might bring immense power and prestige, but for many Habsburgs, it seemed to come with a chilling addition: an alarmingly high number of sudden, violent, or early deaths. It was as if fate, or something darker, had marked certain members of the family for an abrupt departure, often under mysterious or tragic circumstances that left lingering questions and a sense of profound unease. This pattern of premature ends, whether through assassination, execution, or suspicious accidents, paints a disturbing picture of a family shadowed by an unseen hand. One of the most famous and unsettling examples of this curse belongs to Archduke Maximilian of Austria. Born into immense privilege, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I. Maximilian was a man of artistic temperament, a lover of botany and travel, perhaps ill-suited for the harsh realities of power politics. In the 1860s, Napoleon III of France, seeking to establish influence in the Americas, offered Maximilian the crown of Mexico. Despite initial hesitations and warnings from his family, Maximilian, lured by the promise of an imperial adventure and perhaps a desire to forge his own destiny away from his brother's shadow, he and his ambitious wife, Charlotte of Belgium, sailed to Mexico to establish their new empire. However, their reign was fraught with rebellion from the start. Mexican Republican forces, led by Benito Juarez, never recognized his rule. When the American Civil War ended, the United States, adhering to the Monroe Doctrine, put pressure on France to withdraw its troops from Mexico. Napoleon III, facing domestic pressures, did just that. Maximilian was left almost entirely without support. He refused to abandon his loyalists, believing it dishonorable to flee. He was eventually captured by Juarez's forces. Despite pleas for clemency from European powers, including his brother Emperor Franz Joseph and even Victor Hugo, Juarez was unyielding. He believed that an example had to be set to prevent future foreign interventions. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian, dressed in a black suit, was executed by firing squad on a hill near Querétaro. His last words reportedly were, "I forgive everyone, and I ask everyone to forgive me. May my blood, which is about to be shed, flow for the good of the country. Long live Mexico. Long live independence." His death sent shockwaves across Europe, a public and brutal end. For a Habsburg prince, a stark reminder that even the highest birth offered no protection against a determined fate. His body was eventually returned to Austria, a final grim testament to a grand ambition that ended in a premature, violent death far from home. The shadow of the premature end also fell upon Empress Elizabeth of Austria, often known as Sisi. She was Maximilian's sister-in-law, married to his brother Emperor Franz Joseph. The first, Sisi, was an exceptionally beautiful woman, known for her flowing dark hair and tiny waist, but she was deeply unhappy with court life and its rigid protocols. She felt stifled by her role as empress and by the strictures of her marriage. She sought freedom and meaning in poetry, horseback riding, and extensive travel. As she grew older, her melancholic nature deepened, particularly after the tragic death of her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf. She withdrew further from public life, wandering Europe restlessly, often alone. On September 10, 1898, while walking along the promenade by Lake Geneva in Switzerland, she was approached by a 25-year-old Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini. He was not targeting her specifically, but wanted to assassinate any royal. As a statement against the monarchy, he plunged a sharpened stiletto into her chest. Elizabeth did not immediately realize the severity of the wound. Thinking she had merely been punched, she continued walking, even boarding a steamer. Only when she collapsed on deck did her ladies-in-waiting discover the small, almost imperceptible wound that had pierced her heart. She died shortly after, at the age of 60. Her death was shocking, an unprovoked attack on a beloved, if eccentric, empress. It was a completely unexpected and violent end for a woman who had spent much of her life trying to escape the confines of her royal existence, only to be struck down by a random act of violence in a public place. Her life, marked by deep personal sorrow, ended abruptly and brutally, adding another layer to the dark tapestry of Habsburg misfortunes. Perhaps the most historically premature end in Habsburg history belongs to Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He was a complex, often unpopular figure, known for his temper and his passion for hunting. He was also deeply devoted to his wife, Sophie Chotek, a woman of lower noble rank, whom he had married against significant court opposition. Their marriage was a morganatic one, meaning their children could not inherit the throne. A source of constant tension and humiliation for Sophie. On June 28, 1914, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were on an official visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, a territory annexed by Austria-Hungary. Despite warnings of political unrest, they proceeded with their scheduled public appearance. As their motorcade drove through the streets, a young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip, a member of a group called Young Bosnia, stepped forward and fired 2 shots. The first struck Sophie in the abdomen, killing her almost instantly. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. He died minutes later. The assassination was swift, brutal, and shocking. It was not just the death of a royal couple. It was the spark that ignited World War I within weeks, a chain reaction of alliances and declarations. Or engulf. Franz Ferdinand's sudden, violent death did not just end his life prematurely. It effectively ended an era, ushering in an age of unimaginable bloodshed and destruction. His end was not just personal tragedy. It was the premature end of a world order, a monumental event directly tied to the curse of the premature end. The list could extend further. Crown Prince Rudolf, Franz Joseph, and Sisi's only son, died at Merling in 1889 in a suspected murder. Suicide pact with his mistress, a scandal that shook the empire and shrouded in mystery. His death at 30 was a profound blow to the imperial family and destabilized the succession. Even earlier in the 17th century, King Philip III of Spain, a Habsburg, died at the relatively young age of 42 after falling ill. While his death was natural, the constant shadow of early and unexpected demise clung to the family. Whether by blade, bullet, or unexplained circumstances, a chilling number of Habsburgs seemed destined for an abrupt and often violent exit from the world stage, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Number 5. The curse of the unquiet throne. To hold a Habsburg throne was to rule over a diverse and often fractious collection of peoples, languages, and religions, from the Holy Roman Empire to the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy. These vast domains were rarely at peace. The curse of the unquiet throne meant that even at the height of their power, Habsburg rulers found themselves constantly battling internal dissent, external enemies, and the ceaseless struggle to maintain unity and control over their sprawling, multi-ethnic realms. It was a relentless fight, a throne that never offered true rest, always demanding vigilance against the next rebellion, invasion, or political upheaval. During the 16th century, Emperor Charles V, as mentioned earlier, was a prime example of a ruler haunted by the unquiet throne. His reign was a continuous series of military campaigns and political struggles. He fought against Francis I of France for control of Italy in the protracted Italian Wars, a conflict that drained his treasury and stretched his armies across Europe. He faced the rising power of the Ottoman Empire, which threatened his eastern borders and even laid siege to Vienna in 1529. Charles V saw himself as the defender of Christendom, leading campaigns against the Ottomans in North Africa and on the Danube. But perhaps the most enduring source of unrest was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church spread rapidly throughout the Holy Roman Empire, creating deep religious divisions among the German princes. Charles V a staunch Catholic, tried desperately to suppress the new faith, leading to the Schmalkaldic War against the Protestant princes. Even after defeating them in battle, he could not extinguish the movement, eventually being forced to concede religious toleration with the Peace of Habsburg in 1555. His attempts to impose religious uniformity ultimately failed, leaving his empire fragmented and perpetually on the brink of internal conflict. His throne was never truly stable, constantly rocked by religious strife and the ambitions of rival powers, forcing him into a life of ceaseless movement and unending conflict. He could never truly unify his vast domains, always struggling against the centrifugal forces of different languages, cultures, and newly emergent religions within his realm. Centuries later, the unquiet throne continued to plague the Habsburgs, particularly during the reign of Emperor Joseph II in the late 18th century. Joseph II was an enlightened monarch full of ambitious ideas to modernize his empire, centralize power, and improve the lives of his subjects. He sought to implement sweeping reforms, including abolishing serfdom, promoting religious tolerance, even for Protestants and Jews, reforming the legal system, and attempting to bring the Catholic Church under state control. He believed these changes were for the greater good of his people and the empire. However, his reforms were often implemented too quickly, without sufficient regard for tradition or local customs, and without consulting the various states and nationalities within his empire. This disregard for established norms and sensitivities sparked widespread opposition. The Hungarian nobles, fiercely protective of their ancient rights and constitution, resisted his attempts to impose German as the official language and streamline administration. The Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, erupted in open rebellion known as the Brabant Revolution against his religious and administrative reforms. They found his reforms too radical, infringing on their traditional liberties and privileges. Even the common people, who were supposed to benefit from some of his reforms, often resented the drastic changes to their daily lives and religious practices. Joseph II, despite his good intentions, spent much of his reign battling against the very people he sought to uplift. His attempts to modernize and unify the empire only seemed to create more divisions and resistance, leaving his throne constantly in a state of agitation. He died in 1790, a disillusioned and lonely man, feeling that he had failed. Many of his most radical reforms were reversed by his successors, a testament to the persistent difficulty of bringing peace to such an unquiet throne. The 19th century brought new forms of unrest to the Habsburg throne. The rise of nationalism and revolutionary fervor. Emperor Franz Joseph I, who ascended to the throne in 1848, inherited an empire already reeling from revolutionary outbreaks. The Spring of Nations in 1848 saw widespread revolts across Europe, and the Habsburg domains were no exception. Vienna itself experienced street fighting and a brief revolutionary government. But the most serious challenge came from Hungary, where a full-scale revolution erupted, demanding independence from Austrian rule. Led by figures like Lajos Kossuth, the Hungarian revolutionaries fought a determined war against the Habsburgs. Franz Joseph, a young and inexperienced monarch, had to rely on the military might of his generals, and eventually the intervention of Tsar Nicholas, the first of Russia, to crush the Hungarian revolt. The revolution was suppressed with brutal force, leading to executions and widespread repression. While order was restored, the underlying tensions remained. The Hungarian population never forgot their struggle for liberty, and the resentment simmered for decades, eventually forcing the emperor to compromise and create the dual monarchy in 1867. This compromise, the Ausgleich, was an attempt to quiet the Hungarian throne by giving it near equal status with Austria. However, it only shifted the burden of unrest to other nationalities within the empire. Czechs, Poles, South Slavs, and others felt marginalized and continued to demand greater rights and autonomy, creating a constant hum of political instability. The parliament in Vienna was often paralyzed by disputes among different national groups, sometimes descending into outright chaos. Franz Joseph's long reign was a testament to his endurance. but it was also a testament to the fact that his throne for nearly 7 decades was never truly at rest. He spent his life dealing with one crisis after another, perpetually trying to hold together a vast and increasingly fractured empire against the relentless tide of national aspirations and political discontent, a true embodiment of the curse of the unquiet throne. Even beyond the internal struggles, the Habsburgs were often caught in the cross-currents of European power politics, leading to constant external pressures and conflicts. Their strategic location in Central Europe, bordering powerful rivals like France, Prussia, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, meant that their empire was frequently a battleground. From the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, which devastated large parts of the Holy Roman 10th century, which saw Vienna occupied multiple times, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire itself, the Habsburg lands endured almost continuous warfare. These conflicts, whether defensive or aggressive, drained resources, cost countless lives, and kept the throne perpetually unquiet. Each generation seemed to inherit a new set of challenges, new rebellions to crush, new wars to fight, or new political maneuvers to outwit. The very nature of their multinational empire, combined with its central geographical position, seemed to ensure that peace and stability would always be fleeting illusions, making the Habsburg throne an inherently turbulent. Number 4. The curse of the prisoner's crown. For many Habsburgs, the crown was not merely a symbol of power. It felt like a gilded cage. This was the curse of the prisoner's crown. A profound sense of entrapment, whether literal imprisonment, a life defined by suffocating court protocol, or a mind trapped by its own struggles. It was a curse that denied freedom, ambition, or even sanity, forcing some of the most influential figures of their time into a mental or physical confinement that ultimately led to their downfall or despair. One of the most poignant examples of this curse is Emperor Rudolf II. He reigned as Holy Roman Emperor in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. But his story is far from that of a conventional ruler. Rudolf II disliked the political intrigues and public duties of his office. He famously moved his court from Vienna to Prague and rarely left Hrádegyni Castle. His sprawling residence there, he became a recluse, shunning advisors and even his own family. His real passion lay in the arts, sciences, and the occult. He spent vast sums collecting art, jewels, and mechanical devices, creating one of the most magnificent cabinets of curiosities in Europe. He was also deeply fascinated by alchemy, astrology, and magic, sponsoring astronomers like Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler, but also charlatans and mystics. While his patronage led to significant scientific advancements, his obsession with the esoteric and his neglect of state affairs created a deep crisis within the empire. He retreated further into his private world, increasingly paranoid and melancholy. He struggled with periods of deep depression, and what some historians have described as mental illness, possibly schizophrenia. He was a prisoner in his own mind, unable to engage with the outside world, yet unable to escape his imperial responsibilities. His brothers, frustrated by his erratic behavior and the growing instability of the empire, eventually conspired against him. His brother Matthias seized control of Austria-Hungary and Moravia, forcing Rudolf to yield more and more of his power. By 1611, Rudolf was effectively stripped of all his territories except Bohemia, and even then he was compelled to abdicate the Bohemian crown to Matthias. He spent his last months a prisoner in all but name, within his own castle in Prague, isolated, powerless, and profoundly lonely. He died in 1612. A king who had effectively imprisoned himself then was formally imprisoned by his family and the political realities. His crown had become a heavy, solitary burden, confining him to a tragic self-imposed isolation that ultimately led to his downfall. The curse of the prisoner's crown also manifested in a more literal and brutal sense with Archduke Maximilian. As we explored in The Curse of the Premature End, Maximilian accepted the crown of Mexico, but his reign there quickly devolved into a nightmare. From the moment he arrived, he was trapped between the conflicting demands of his French backers, the conservative Mexican factions who had supported his ascension, and the overwhelming popular opposition of the Mexican people. He found himself a monarch without a true base of support, constantly reliant on foreign troops. When Napoleon III withdrew French military assistance, Maximilian was left completely exposed. He was advised by many to flee, but he felt honor-bound to remain. He was ultimately captured by Republican forces and held prisoner. His imprisonment was not long, but it was absolute. He was tried by a military court which swiftly condemned him to death. Despite international appeals, there was no escaping his fate. He spent his final days under guard awaiting his execution. This was the ultimate physical manifestation of the prisoner's crown. A monarch once grand and ambitious, reduced to a captive, stripped of all power, facing certain death. He traveled across an ocean to gain a throne, only for that throne to become his prison and eventually his execution block. A stark, violent confinement that ended his life far too soon. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of a life lived as a prisoner to the crown's expectations was Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Sisi. From the moment she married Emperor Franz Joseph I, she felt suffocated by the rigid formality and relentless public scrutiny of the Habsburg court. Sisi was a free spirit who loved the countryside, poetry, and writing, and she loathed the endless ceremonies, the constant judging of her appearance, and the expectations placed upon her as empress. She famously developed an obsession with her appearance, spending hours exercising and riding to maintain her tiny waist, effectively becoming a prisoner of her own beauty standards and societal pressure. She was trapped in a gilded cage, bound by the expectations of her position but deeply unhappy within it. To escape this perceived imprisonment, she began to travel extensively, often alone or with only a small entourage, visiting distant lands, bathing in the sea, writing poetry. These journeys were her desperate attempts to find freedom, but they also highlighted her estrangement from her family and her duties. She was a constant wanderer, always seeking to escape the prison of Vienna and her imperial role. Even when at home, she would often retreat to her private apartments, avoiding court functions and living a life of internal exile. Her spirit was confined, and her body, though physically free to roam, was constantly managed and perfected to meet an impossible ideal. Ultimately, her constant quest for freedom ended in a violent, unprovoked attack in Switzerland. But her entire life had been a struggle against the invisible bars of her royal prison, a testament to the curse of the prisoner's crown. Her yearning for freedom was never fully satisfied, and her life became a tragic cycle of escape and re-entrapment by her own fame and position. Number 3. The curse of ill-fated loves and marriages. The Habsburgs, like all royal families, understood that marriage was not just about love. It was about power, alliances, and securing the bloodline. But for generations their union seemed to be shadowed by a persistent and painful misfortune. The curse of ill-fated loves and marriages meant that many Habsburgs found themselves trapped in unhappy unions, faced with childlessness, or endured the heartbreaking loss of beloved spouses and children. These were not just political arrangements, they were personal tragedies played out on a grand historical stage. King Philip II of Spain, a fervent Catholic Habsburg, ruler of the 16th century, provides a stark example of this curse. He was married 4 times, and each marriage was marked by loss and sorrow. His first wife was Maria Manuela, Princess of Portugal. She gave birth to their only child, Don Carlos, but she died just days later due to complications from childbirth. Philip was left a widower at a young age with a sickly and difficult heir. His second marriage was perhaps the most politically significant, but personally tragic. He married Mary I of England, often known as Bloody Mary. This union was designed to cement an alliance between Spain and England and to bring England back into the Catholic fold. However, the marriage was deeply unpopular in England, and Mary herself was consumed by her desire to produce an heir and secure a Catholic succession. She suffered from 2 phantom pregnancies, experiencing the physical symptoms but ultimately no child. Her desperate hope for a child became a public spectacle, and her failure was a source of profound personal anguish. Mary's health declined, and she died childless in 1558, just 4 years after their marriage, ending Philip's hopes of ruling England through her. Philip's third marriage was to Elizabeth of Valois, the daughter of the King of France. This marriage was originally intended for his son Don Carlos, but Philip decided to marry her himself for political reasons. Elizabeth was young and reportedly beautiful and intelligent. Despite the political nature of their union, they seemed to develop genuine affection. However, this marriage was also short-lived and tragic. Elizabeth suffered 2 miscarriages and gave birth to 2 daughters, who survived, but no male heir. In 1568, she died after another miscarriage at the age of 23. This was a significant personal blow to Philip, who is said to have grieved deeply. To add to the tragedy, just months before Elizabeth's death, his troubled son, Don Carlos, died in mysterious circumstances, while imprisoned by his father. This double loss left Philip bereft of a male heir and further deepened his melancholy. Finally, Philip married his niece Anna of Austria, his 4th wife. She successfully gave birth to 5 children, including a long-awaited male heir, Philip, who would become Philip III. However, only young Philip survived infancy. The other 4 children died very young. Anna herself died in 1580, just a few years after giving birth to their heir. So, out of 4 marriages, Philip II saw 3 wives die prematurely, endured multiple miscarriages and the deaths of many of his children, and was plagued by the difficulties of his troubled first son. His personal life was a relentless cycle of hope and profound loss, a truly ill-fated pattern for a man whose marriages were meant to secure a dynasty. The curse of ill-fated loves and marriages continued into later centuries, perhaps most famously with Marie Antoinette. Born an Austrian archduchess, the daughter of Empress Maria Theresa, she was married off at the tender age of 14 to the future King Louis XVI of France. This marriage was a grand political alliance designed to cement peace between the old rivals, France and Austria. From the beginning, the union was fraught with difficulties. The young couple struggled to produce an heir for years, leading to immense public pressure and scandalous rumors in a highly critical French court. It took 7 years for the marriage to be consummated and for Marie Antoinette to become pregnant. This long delay contributed significantly to her initial unpopularity and fueled gossip about her and her husband, as Queen Marie Antoinette became a lightning rod for criticism, blamed for France's financial woes, and seen as frivolous and out of touch. Her extravagant lifestyle and perceived Austrian loyalties made her deeply disliked by many French people. The personal tragedy of her marriage was overshadowed by the growing political storm that consumed France. The French Revolution erupted, sweeping away the monarchy. Marie Antoinette, her husband, and their children were imprisoned. The love and devotion she eventually found with Louis XVI could not save them from their fate. She witnessed the execution of her husband, was separated from her children, and endured a show trial that condemned her as a traitor. She was guillotined in October 1793, dying a violent public death. Her marriage, intended to secure peace and dynasty, instead led to personal humiliation, political ruin, and a brutal end for herself and her family. It was a union that started with difficulty and ended in complete catastrophe, a tragic chapter in the history of ill-fated Habsburg marriages. Even for those who were not executed, unhappiness often shadowed their unions. Empress Elizabeth Sisi married her cousin Emperor Franz Joseph I in a match arranged when she was just 16. What began as a seemingly romantic story quickly soured. Franz Joseph was deeply devoted to his duties and expected a dutiful empress, while Sisi was a free spirit who yearned for personal freedom and disdained court protocol. They were fundamentally incompatible, and their marriage became increasingly distant. Sisi found the Viennese court suffocating, her mother-in-law, Archduchess Sophie, overbearing, and her duties as empress unbearable. She felt trapped and misunderstood. She sought escape in extensive travel, poetry, and an obsessive pursuit of physical perfection. Her relationship with Franz Joseph became one of polite formality, marked by long periods of separation. While they maintained a level of mutual respect, and Franz Joseph remained devoted to her until her death, their marriage was rarely one of companionship or shared happiness. It was a lonely existence for both of them, a union that failed to bring personal fulfillment, particularly for Sisi, who constantly felt like a bird in a cage. Her escape from this unhappy marriage through her travels ultimately led her to her premature and violent end. The crown might have brought them together, but it also seemed to pull them apart, leaving behind a legacy of quiet desperation and unfulfilled emotional connection, another testament to the curse of ill-fated loves and marriages among the Habsburgs. Number 2. The curse of childless crowns. A royal family's very existence depends on the ability to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, to continue the dynastic line. For the Habsburgs, this fundamental requirement seemed to be an endless source of anxiety and profound disappointment, a recurring pattern of childless marriages, high infant mortality, and ultimately the complete extinction of major branches of their family. This was the curse of childless crowns, the terrifying void of an empty nursery or a throne, with no direct successor, leading to succession. Crises, wars, and the ultimate fading of mighty empires. The most famous and devastating manifestation of this curse fell upon the Spanish Habsburg line. For centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had intermarried extensively with other branches of the Habsburg family, and with other royal houses, often choosing close relatives to maintain power and consolidate alliances. This practice, while common among European royalty, reached an extreme degree within the Spanish Habsburgs. The culmination of this intense inbreeding was King Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. From birth, Charles was afflicted with numerous physical and mental disabilities. He was intellectually slow, suffered from a vast array of health problems, and had the exaggerated Habsburg jaw to a grotesque degree, making it difficult for him to speak or chew food. Contemporary accounts describe him as sickly, frail, and prone to illness. His survival to adulthood was itself a testament to the dedication of his caregivers, as many royal children with such infirmities died young. Despite his severe physical and mental frailties, the survival of the Spanish Habsburg dynasty rested entirely upon Charles II, producing an heir. He was married twice. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a beautiful and spirited French princess. The court and the entire kingdom eagerly awaited the news of a pregnancy. However, year after year passed, and no child was conceived. Marie-Louise grew increasingly desperate and despondent, falling into a deep depression. She died suddenly in 1689, at the age of 26, leaving the throne still without an heir. Charles was pressured to marry again, and he took as his second wife Maria Anna of Nolberg. This marriage too was fruitless. Maria Anna tried everything from traditional remedies to pilgrimages and superstitions, but she never became pregnant. The Spanish court was consumed by the succession question, leading to endless intrigues and power struggles among European powers, eager to claim the vast Spanish inheritance. Charles II himself was painfully aware of his inability to produce an heir. He grew increasingly superstitious, convinced he was bewitched, and underwent exorcisms. He died in 1700 at the age of 38, completely childless. His death, without a direct successor, plunged Europe into the devastating War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that lasted for over a decade and reshaped the balance of power on the continent. The direct Spanish Habsburg line, which had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries, ended with Charles II, a victim of the curse of childless crowns, and perhaps the tragic consequences of their own family policies. His crown, the richest in Europe, became the symbol of his family's extinction. This curse was not limited to the Spanish line. Even in the main Austrian branch, securing the succession was often a desperate struggle. Emperor Charles VI, Maria Theresa's father, reigned in the early 18th century. He spent much of his reign obsessed with ensuring his succession. He had no surviving male heirs, only daughters. To ensure his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, could inherit his vast Habsburg lands, which traditionally passed through the male line, he issued the Pragmatic Sanction in 1713. This decree declared that his lands were indivisible and could be inherited by a female heir if there were no male heirs. He then spent decades tirelessly negotiating with other European powers, securing their recognition of the Pragmatic Sanction through concessions and treaties. He was so consumed by this that he arguably neglected other crucial matters of state. Particularly strengthening his military, he believed he had secured his daughter's inheritance. However, the moment he died in 1740, many of the very powers who had signed the sanction immediately broke their promises and challenged Maria Theresa's right to rule, leading to the War of the Austrian Succession. While Maria Theresa ultimately managed to hold onto most of her inheritance, her father's desperate struggle to prevent a childless crown from sparking a dynastic crisis highlights the constant anxiety and the immense political fallout. The threat of an empty throne, even with a strong female successor, was enough to ignite a continent-wide conflict. Even when heirs were born, infant mortality rates were frighteningly high, snatching away potential successors and leaving royal parents heartbroken. And their dynasties vulnerable. Empress Maria Theresa. Despite having 16 children with her beloved husband, Emperor Francis I, lost many of them in infancy or childhood. Of her 16 children, 10 survived to adulthood, a relatively good rate for the time, but still a significant loss. These deaths, while common in that era, still placed immense pressure on the surviving children and the need to produce more. Her son, Joseph II, himself struggled with the curse. He was married twice, first to Isabella of Parma, whom he deeply loved. She gave birth to a daughter, Maria Theresa, but tragically died of smallpox just 22 years old. Along with their second daughter, Joseph was heartbroken and never fully recovered from her loss. He then married his second cousin, Maria Josepha of Bavaria, a marriage of political convenience. Joseph found her physically unattractive, and their relationship was cold. She also died of smallpox, just 2 years into their marriage, childless. Joseph never remarried. He died childless himself, and the throne passed to his brother Leopold II. Joseph's personal tragedy of losing a beloved wife and 2 daughters, and then failing to produce an heir with his second wife, underscored the relentless pattern of the curse. The Spanish Habsburg story with Charles II is the ultimate narrative of the childless crown leading to the end of a vast imperial line and a major European war. But the general pattern of intense anxiety over succession, the high rates of infant and child mortality, and the personal anguish of royal couples unable to produce a surviving heir, continued to plague the Habsburgs through centuries. It was a constant source of vulnerability, a dark cloud hanging over the glittering palaces, a reminder that without the continuation of the bloodline, even the grandest empire was ultimately doomed to fade. A relentless and unforgiving curse on their crowns. Number 1. The curse of the bloodline's burden. Perhaps the most haunting and physically visible of the Habsburg curses was the burden carried within their very bloodline. For centuries, the family engaged in a systematic practice of intermarriage, often marrying close relatives like first cousins, uncles to nieces, and even double cousins. This was a common practice among European royalty, designed to consolidate power, maintain alliances, and keep wealth and influence within the family. However, for the Habsburgs, this intense and prolonged inbreeding seemed to accumulate a terrible cost, manifesting in a distinctive physical deformity and, perhaps more tragically, in a pervasive pattern of mental instability and profound physical weakness. The most famous physical manifestation of this bloodline burden was the Habsburg jaw, also known as mandibular prognathism. This condition caused the lower jaw to protrude significantly, leading to an overbite that made chewing and speaking difficult. While some artistic depictions might exaggerate it, historical accounts and later scientific studies confirm its prevalence. From Emperor Maximilian I in the late 15th century to King Charles II of Spain in the late 17th century, this distinctive jawline was a recurring feature, a genetic signature marking them as Habsburgs. It was a subtle yet undeniable physical burden passed down through their tightly controlled lineage. While not debilitating on its own for most, it was a visible sign of their unique genetic heritage, a physical mark of their exclusive bloodline. Far more devastating than a physical feature was the pervasive mental instability that seemed to shadow the Habsburg family tree. The most well-known case is that of Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad, the daughter of the powerful Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, and mother of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Joanna was a pivotal figure. She married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg, forging the crucial dynastic link between Spain and the Habsburgs of Austria. But Joanna's life was marked by profound emotional turmoil and what contemporaries described as madness. She was deeply, almost obsessively in love with her husband, Philip. When he died suddenly in 1506, her grief was all-consuming and utterly extreme. She famously refused to be separated from his coffin, carrying it with her for years as she traveled across Spain, occasionally opening it to gaze upon his decaying remains. This behavior, combined with her reclusive nature and her refusal to govern, led her father and later her son, Charles V, to declare her unfit to rule. She was effectively imprisoned for decades in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, until her death in 1555. While modern historians debate the exact nature of her condition, was it severe depression, psychosis, or perhaps just a spirited woman whose behavior was deemed inconvenient by powerful men? Her story remains a chilling example of a royal figure whose mind seemed to unravel, leading to her removal from power and a lifetime of confinement, a heavy burden within the bloodline. Centuries later, the ghost of mental fragility continued to haunt the family. Emperor Rudolf II, whom we discussed as a prisoner of his crown, also exemplified the bloodline's mental burden. As he retreated from the world, his eccentricities grew into profound melancholy, paranoia, and periods of deep depression. He was known to suffer from bouts of what his contemporaries called melancholia and fits of madness. He became increasingly isolated, neglecting his duties and trusting few. This mental deterioration led directly to his family seizing control of his imperial powers. While it is difficult to diagnose historical figures, the descriptions of his behavior align with what might today be considered a severe mental illness, rendering him incapable of effective rule. His struggles to cope with the pressures of his position, compounded by an apparent predisposition to mental illness, left him isolated and ultimately stripped of his power. A tragic illustration of the internal battle many Habsburgs faced. The physical weakness and chronic illness were also a persistent burden. Many Habsburg children suffered from high infant mortality, which was common in the era, but also from a wide range of specific ailments and general debility that often meant they did not survive to adulthood or lived short, sickly lives. This was particularly evident in the Spanish line leading up to King Charles II. Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg king, was the epitome of this curse. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandmother was also his great-aunt. The family tree was less a tree and more a tangled shrub. As a result, Charles was born with an astonishing accumulation of genetic problems. He did not walk until he was 6 years old and could not speak until he was 4. He had an enormous head, a tongue so large he could barely speak or eat, and was frequently ill, suffering from fevers, convulsions, and various infections throughout his short life. He was described by contemporary observers as feeble-minded and constantly sick. An autopsy performed after his death revealed a severely damaged and degenerated body with organs of unusual size, and a heart described as the size of a peppercorn. His condition was so severe that it is widely believed his physical and mental infirmities were a direct result of the extreme inbreeding within his family. He could not produce an heir, and his very existence was a painful living testament to the bloodline's burden, leading directly to the end of the powerful Spanish Habsburg dynasty and triggering a major European war for his empty throne. His tragic life and ultimate inability to continue the line solidified the idea that the Habsburg pursuit of maintaining power through endogamy ultimately led to their genetic downfall. From the visible Habsburg jaw to the profound mental anguish of rulers like Joanna the Mad and Rudolph II, and the severe physical and intellectual disabilities of Charles II, the consistent and often debilitating issues within the Habsburg family seemed to speak of a deep-seated inherited burden. Their ambitious marriage strategies designed to secure power and lineage ultimately seemed to have a devastating and unforeseen consequence, leading a trail of suffering and, in some cases, literally ending their direct lines.